From abysmal sales, partnership betrayals, punishing working hours, and even an attempt to take one's own life, the localization history of the Trails series is dark, depressing, and heartbreaking. To the extent that these repeated challenges in the series' localizations would eventually be known as the Curse of Trails. But from a single and extremely niche Japanese role-playing game released back in 2011, Trails has now flourished into a popular and flagship JRPG series with 10 titles localized. How exactly did a series with its fate outside Japan so close to death turn into a staple among the JRPG community? Let's find out by exploring exactly how the localizers of the Trails series overcame all odds and the Curse of Trails to achieve the impossible by localizing 10 colossal-sized Trails games in 12 years. This video will focus on the history of the series' localizations and does not contain any game or series spoilers outside of the promotional videos and trailers used. The history of the series' cruel and unforgiving localization history begins with Trails in the Sky, the first game of the series. In 2010, localization company Xseed Games set its sights on the rights to localize Nihon Falcom's Trails in the Sky trilogy, a series of JRPGs released on the PSP. In Japan, the Trails series was still young, but each and every title in the series was met with praise and commercial success. The opportunity looked too good to pass up, and Xseed naively committed to releasing the trilogy's first game the following year. But what Xseed would soon learn about Trails is the size of its script was truly not like anything they had ever seen before. At around 1.5 million Japanese characters, Trails in the Sky script was 3 times longer than most Final Fantasy games. And it's not just the size that's terrifying. Trails games are filled with thousands of obscure references, foreshadowing, unique terminology, and non-playable characters with dialogue that tends to refresh after every major story development. It is what the series is known for, and why its world building is top tier, and in my opinion, better than any other game series out there. But unfortunately for the localization, this meant an intricately and chaotically interwoven web of dialogue that needs to be localized perfectly to make any sense. And so what exactly did this mean for Xseed? Time to knuckle down and work their asses off to meet their own deadline. And for the game's editor, Jess, it would mean 9 months of torture. 14-hour days, 6 days a week, for 9 months were spent going over the game's script with a fine-tooth comb, making sure every term, reference, and character dialogue was consistent and correct. And was it worth it? Not in the slightest. Trails in the Sky was a commercial failure. With the PSP on its way out and the nicheness of JRPGs, sales had fallen well below expectations. And sadly for Jess, the toll of the localization led to immense burnout and extreme weight loss. This left both fans and Xseed in an awful situation. Trails in the Sky is a phenomenal game, and at the time had truly left its mark on the small few who played it, myself included. It didn't help that it's almost impossible to finish Trails in the Sky without immediately wanting to play its sequel, Trails in the Sky Second Chapter. And so any Xseed tweet or press release, even if it was completely unrelated to Trails, would be met with a bombardment of questions about if and when fans would see its sequel localized. But the PSP was on its last legs, and the script of Second Chapter was estimated to be double the size of Trails in the Sky. How could Xseed commercially justify to committing double the effort, time, and resources for a game that was guaranteed to sell less than its underperforming predecessor? It was obvious that the series' future in the West was non-existent. So fans had thought. And that's where the first ray of hope began to shine, before things took a much darker turn. After more than 2 years of silence, Following Trails in the Sky's release, fans had lost all hope that its sequel would ever be localized. Little did they know that behind the scenes, a miracle was in the making. In 2011, Carpe Foga, a game localization studio who had recent commercial success localizing niche Japanese games, would approach Xseed with an offer they couldn't refuse. The studio would offer to localize second chapter on Xseed's behalf, and so an agreement between both parties was made. While Carpe Foga would handle the game's gigantic script, it wasn't the only hurdle in the game's localization. With the PlayStation Vita around the corner, the PSP was at the end of its life, but not all hope was lost. In 2013, Xseed would see commercial success localizing Falcom's other titles, notably the E-Series, for the PC. It was this success that would eventually bring Falcom on board with the localization of second chapter for both PSP and PC. Something they were hesitant to agree to following the failure of Trails in the Sky outside Japan. Although the game's fate was in limbo until Falcom's agreement in 2013, Carpe Foga had already been working away on the game's script since 2011. With all the stars finally aligned, Xseed were confident to announce to the world that fans would finally get to play second chapter in the summer of 2014. To support second chapter's PC release, Xseed would also announce that Trails in the Sky was due for a PC port in the winter of 2013. And this is when the dominoes begin to fall, leading to two of the darkest years in the series' localization history. First, let's look at the PC port of Trails in the Sky. Although Xseed had an in-house PC programmer, their attempt to modernize the game's ancient Japanese PC release from 2004 proved challenging. These challenges would cause the delay in release from winter 2013 to summer 2014, the same release window of when its sequel was due for launch. And now for its sequel, where do we even begin? Warning, this section speaks of an individual attempting to take their own life. If this is triggering, please skip to the next video chapter. Consistent with the experience of localizing Trails in the Sky, Xseed would soon discover issues shortly after second chapter's announcement. Upon receiving what Carpe Foga had completed, Xseed would soon notice that they had been translating key terminology inconsistently with the script of the game's predecessor. They also hadn't localized the game's script in the format requested by Xseed. This little mishap would cause 2 months of tedious copy and paste work to fix, for none other than Jess. Remember her? Part 2 of her Trails-induced suffering had yet to even begin. Mishaps and inconsistencies aside, the biggest issue was the lack of progress Carpe Foga had been making. After 2 years of working in the shadows, only 50% of the game's script had been both translated and edited. These issues would slowly strain the relationship between the two parties. Xseed also started to grow impatient, and the pressure started to bubble. That same pressure would eventually become the trigger for Carpe Foga's lead editor, known as SpaceDrake, to attempt to take his own life. Revealed in a blog post following the incident, a series of unfortunate physical and mental health incidents had caused SpaceDrake to fall behind on his work editing second chapter's script. The tremendous pressure from falling behind on editing such an enormous script would take its toll, and SpaceDrake would fall into a debilitating depression that resulted in months of no progress. SpaceDrake continued to spiral and would eventually outright ignore Xseed's queries, which were starting to ramp up. Xseed would eventually get Carpe Foga's lead translator involved, who had no idea about the delays caused by his colleague. For SpaceDrake, the shame was too much, and the pressure had reached its tipping point, literally. And in March 2014, SpaceDrake would hold a knife above his chest, ready to take his own life. Fortunately, his colleague was able to make it in time and prevented a tragedy. And so, with all things considered, summer 2014 was not the season for the game's release, Instead, it marked the end of Xseed's relationship with Carpe Folger. Second chapter was handed over to Xseed to complete. Xseed had no other choice but to announce the delay to second chapter's release and immediately start rolling up their sleeves. With 50% of second chapter's script equaling roughly the entire size of its predecessor's script, Xseed had their work cut out for them. Though a script this size took 9 months of inhumane working hours for Jess to edit for Trails in the Sky, she would be only given 6 months to do the same for second chapter. Crunch time in the game development and localization industry is truly a horrific sight to behold. Once the script had been edited, it would total over 700,000 English words, about 1.5 times longer than the entire Lord of the Rings trilogy novels. Xseed's quality assurers would then spend the next 5 months getting extremely familiar with all 700,000 words and 70 hours of gameplay second chapter has to offer. Sadly, this testing would identify a number of bugs in both the PSP and PC versions of the game. We're talking about weird text glitches, crashes, getting stuck in walls, and even glowing balls of light for an arse. While Xseed's in-house programmer could crack away at the bugs in the PC version instantly, they were relying on Falcom to fix the PSP version. The continued back and forth between testing and waiting on Falcom would only contribute to the delays. But after 4 years of second chapter consuming the soul of everyone who touched its localization, Xseed would take to social media in October 2015 to announce that second chapter was finally ready and due for release in less than a week. And on October 2015, second chapter would finally launch, ending the torturous 4.5-year wait following its predecessor's release. The launch of second chapter was not only the release of one of the greatest JRPGs of all time, it also signified the period of when this series' awful localization history would finally change for the better. A month before second chapter's release, the most unexpected thing happened. Xseed announced the localization of both Trails of Cold Steel 1 and 2 for the PS3 and PS Vita, the first of which was due for release only a few months following second chapter. After 4 agonizing years of nothing, fans would be rewarded with 2 Trails games only months apart. The announcement was also the first sign that the series might actually have a future outside Japan. Things were finally looking up. So then, how was it that the announcement was received with criticism and almost divided the hardcore fans of the series? For those unfamiliar, Cold Steel 1 and 2 are the 6th and 7th games in the series. Although they take place in the same universe and timeline as the Sky trilogy, Cold Steel is the beginning of a new arc. Likewise, second chapter is the conclusion of the Sky arc, with Sky the Third more of a standalone sequel. Regardless, this announcement would mean skipping over 3 Trails games in between second chapter and Cold Steel 1. Hardcore fans who had experienced the Japanese releases were firm on the view that playing Cold Steel 1 without Sky the Third, Trails of Zero, and Trails to Azure would ruin the experience. Not to mention all 3 skip games were renowned for being fantastic. Fortunately, Xseed had a good habit of being extremely transparent with Trails fans. In a blog post, Xseed shared that it was Falcom who approached them to localize the Cold Steel titles, not the other way around. When Xseed shared concerns around the missing games, it was Falcom who provided assurance to Xseed that the Cold Steel arc was developed for newcomers to the series in mind. And so in December 2015, Cold Steel 1 would successfully launch without any glaring issues or unforeseen delays. It would be the first of now many Trails games outside of Japan to launch on the modern consoles of their time. Cold Steel 2 would also successfully launch only 9 months later. The nightmares of Trails in the Sky and second chapter's localization seemed to finally be behind Xseed, and in the span of a year, Exceed had localized 3 Trails games. Life as a Trails fan was truly at its peak, and things would get even better. 6 months prior to Cold Steel 2's release, Exceed would announce that they were working on the localization of Trails in the Sky the Third. Exceed were truly unstoppable, and fans couldn't get enough. This would be the second time Exceed would announce the next Trails game before the last announced one was even released. What was once a niche and commercially unviable JRPG series would turn into one of Exceed's flagship titles. And it's all thanks to PC gaming. Second Chapter and especially Trails in the Sky sold well beyond expectations on the PC. Both games were lucky to release at a time where PC ports of JRPGs outside of Japan were still quite rare, and Trails in the Sky came in at the exact right price point. And so with the PSP well and truly dead, Sky the Third was scheduled for release on PC only. From a localization perspective, Exceed had finally found a rhythm that worked. Once the translation of a Trails game had been completed by a freelance translator, one very passionate about the Trails series, it would then be passed back to Exceed for editing, testing, and release. However, as soon as one translation was complete, the translator would immediately begin working on the next game, and the cycle would continue. And so, 8 months after Cold Steel 2, Sky the Third would successfully launch in 2017. This release achieved 2 important milestones in the series' localization history. The first was that it gave hope that the crossbow duology, Trails of Zero and Trails to Azure, could also one day be localized and ported to PC, similar to Sky the Third. The second was that other than the crossbow duology, the launch of Sky the Third marked the first time that fans outside Japan would be caught up to this series' Japanese releases. While Trails of Cold Steel 3 was only just around the corner for release in Japan, gone were the days that the series' future was non-existent and fans were 4 to 5 games behind its Japanese releases. Exceed had truly overcome the impossible to get the series' localization to this point. But sadly, this success would soon be overshadowed by something incredibly unfortunate that was brewing. 2 months before Sky the Third was released, localization studio NIS America announced that they were localizing Falcom's flagship title Ys 8 Lacrimosa of Dana. What the heck does this have to do with Trails, you might ask? Well, up until Ys 8, Exceed had localized every single Ys title. Similar to Trails, Exceed took a gamble on a niche JRPG series by Falcom and made it successful outside Japan. But unlike Trails, the Ys series had very little text and sold incredibly well from day one. So why then did Falcom kick Exceed to the curb and choose NIS to take the Ys series forward outside Japan? While there's no official answer, staff from Exceed confirmed that they tried to secure the rights to Ys 8. Meaning it's likely that NIS were able to financially outbid Exceed for it and were able to assist Falcom in porting the title to modern consoles. Immediately, fans began to worry. What would this mean for Trails of Cold Steel 3? Trails and Ys games had done so well outside Japan thanks to the enormous amount of love, charm, and effort Exceed had put into their localizations. But on the other hand, NIS's localizations at the time were often met with scrutiny, leaving fans quite concerned. And these concerns would become reality when Ys 8 launched 4 months after Sky the Third. Ys 8 launched in September 2017 with a localization so bad, it was almost amusing. The backlash caused NIS to issue an official apology and re-edit the game's entire script for a future patch update. The threat that the Trails series would be taken over by NIS and localized to the same standard became very real. And so, the pieces slowly started to fall. A year following the release of Ys 8, former Exceed staff Brittany would announce her departure from Exceed. Brittany is the biggest advocate for the Trails series in the localization industry. Not only has she had a hand in every Trails game that Exceed released, she was also the lead editor of Cold Steel 2 and Sky the Third. It was her love and passion for the series that helped continue the momentum of Trails localizations following second chapter. And a few months after Brittany's announcement, it happened. Fans' fears would come to life.
No! God, please, no! No!
In January 2019, NIS announced that they were releasing Trails of Cold Steel 3 later that year. Exceed had been replaced as Falcom's localization partner, and they haven't touched a new Falcom title again. As someone who's been following Trails since Trails in the Sky, this was heartbreaking to witness. The partnership between Exceed and Falcom was truly special, and it was incredible seeing Exceed bring all of Falcom's niche series to life outside Japan, especially Ys and Trails. But hey, that's capitalism for you. After the failure that was Ys 8, NIS was extremely conscious of fans expecting Cold Steel 3's localization to be horrendous. It didn't help that Cold Steel 3's script was over 1.5 times bigger than second chapter's, totaling over 1 million English words. NIS would have to pull out all the stop to make Cold Steel 3 a success. And to everyone's surprise, that's exactly what they did. After all, one man's trash is another man's treasure. For the game's translation, NIS would use the same freelancer who translated Cold Steel 1, 2, and Sky the Third. They would also bring on board former Exceed staff Brittany and Chris. Chris was an editor for both Cold Steel 1 and 2. But the real asset was Brittany, who, as mentioned earlier, had a huge hand to play in Cold Steel 1, 2, and Sky the Third. NIS's efforts don't stop there though. They managed to get most of Cold Steel 1 and 2's voice acting cast to reprise their roles for Cold Steel 3. NIS would also slam the accelerator on the game's promotion, featuring Cold Steel 3 at just about every relevant expo and going on a trailer making spree. And in October that same year, Cold Steel 3 launched. Its release would prove most doubts about the game's localization wrong. The world did not end, and Cold Steel 3 launched with a relatively great localization and no game-breaking bugs. While there were instances of poorly edited dialogue and incorrect item descriptions, NIS would quickly patch them up. The same level of love would be applied to Cold Steel 4, which would release almost exactly a year after Cold Steel 3. Like Exceed, NIS would find their groove and be able to manage the beast that is the Trails series. Bringing us to the next miracle to grace the series' localization history. Although fans were extremely grateful for 6 Trails localizations in the span of 5 years, it was hard to forget about those that were forgotten, Trails from Zero and Trails to Azure. These 2 titles form the Crossbow duology, another arc in the overarching story of the Trails series. But despite the surging success of the Trails series outside Japan, fans were losing both hope and patience that the Crossbow duology would ever be localized. To the point they would take matters into their own hands and release fan translations for both titles. While these translations were playable, they were rough around the edges. It was then that a group of fans calling themselves the Geofront formed to turn these rough translations into a professional level fan translation that rivaled the quality of Exceed's and NIS's work. And so, Geofront gave Trails from Zero and Trails to Azure the love they desperately needed and released patches for the Japanese PC versions of both games. With the duology only available on now dead consoles or on archaic PCs, the duology was already unattractive for an official localization. And with Geofront's professional level fan translation making the need for an official localization redundant, the chance of one happening was getting slimmer. But to everyone's surprise, NIS made a bold move. They partnered with the Geofront and announced that they would use the fan translations as the core of an official localization of the Crossbow duology. Even better, both games would not only release on PC, but would be ported to the PlayStation 4 and Nintendo Switch. Trails from Zero launched in September 2022, with Trails to Azure launching only 5 months later in March 2023. And it doesn't stop there. Trails into Reverie, game number 10 of the series, would quickly follow, releasing only 4 months later in July 2023. For the second time in the series' localization history, 3 Trails titles would receive official localizations within a year, which is absolute insanity when you consider the enormous script sizes and unique challenges each title brought to their respective localizers, mainly Exceed. At the time this video releases, there are only 2 Trails titles yet to be localized, Kuro no Kiseki 1 and 2. And NIS only just announced the localization of the first, titled Trails Through Daybreak, for summer 2024. We are finally at the point where it's no longer a matter of if a Trails title will be localized, but simply a matter of when. A very different tale to how this story started. And there you have it. After 12 years since Trails in the Sky launched, 10 titles are now localized. The journey was long, emotionally exhausting, and awfully cruel to those involved. And although the circumstances around the switch from XC to NIS was rightfully so unfair, both localizers would step up to the challenge, achieve the impossible, and localize 5 enormous Trails games each. And it's thanks to their efforts that the curse of Trails plaguing the series' localization history is no more. At least, for now. If you made it this far, please accept my thanks for watching. If you'd like more, it'd mean the world to me if you subscribe to my channel. But more than anything, as a huge Trails fan myself, I'd love to connect with fans of the series. Let me know in the comments your thoughts on the history of the series' localizations. If you were around during the roller coaster that was second chapter, I'd love to know your thoughts on the situation.